Good morning and welcome to the CABE webinar Wednesday. Today we're looking at organisational capability with Mark Snelling. This presentation will cover the definition of organisational capability, various competence levels, and the background of building BSAS 01-2024, the Organisational Capability Management System Standard. My name is Shanika and I'm the Training and Learning Coordinator here at CABE, and I'll be acting as moderator for this morning's session. We strive to create interactive webinars, so we do encourage you to submit any questions you may have during the session. These questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. We'll get through as many as possible, but if we do run out of time, we'll collect any questions and send the answers out in due course. You can also contact us on webinars@cbuilde.com. If you're watching us live today, you can get in touch with us using the side panel to send in your questions. Alternatively, you can get in touch with us via the social links now on screen. Let me introduce today's webinar speaker, Mark Snelling. Mark is a health, safety and fire consultant for the Property Institute, a member of the HSE's Interim Industry Competence Committee and the founder director of the Building Safety Alliance, and has developed safety management systems for organisations like Ernst & Young and SAS Scandinavian Airlines. Mark is the technical author for the Property Institute's guidance notes and has written for various industry bodies. He's a chartered builder of MCIOB, a graduate member of IOSH, and the president and fellow of the Association of Project Safety. So give me a couple of seconds, I'll just hand over to Mark and he'll begin shortly. Mark, you'll be able to share your screen now.
Good morning, everybody. It's interesting when you hear your CV read back to you and you realise it's ever so slightly out of date. But anyway, it's my bona fides is sitting there in front of you. If I start this morning by looking at competence in general, and then we'll move into organisational capability and then the standard, and to some degree the implementation of the standard, which is where we're going. It's the word is an auspicious day with the Grenfell inquiry final report coming out today, and we will see, I think, by the end of the day, the direction we're all travelling, although we are on that journey now. The Building Regulation Amendment England regulations amended the building regulations out of the back of the Building Safety Act. And that introduced, I think, the most significant change that came out of the Building Safety Act, which is Part 2A, duty holders and competence under the building regulations. And this diagram tries to illustrate that those duty holder and competence requirements relate to all work to which the building regulations apply. They work to high-risk buildings and any other buildings to which the building regulations apply. So it's applicable across the piece. The duties map those in CDM, and I think the Part 2A duty and competence was based originally on the wording within the CDM regulation, so they should be familiar to those who are familiar with CDM. And they require any person, we're not just talking about the client, any person proposing to carry out building work or design work to ensure that any person, and person in the legal terms is individual or organisation, but any person, individual in this case, to take all reasonable steps to satisfy themselves that that person fulfills the competence general requirements, or whether in training they're appropriately supervised. And there is an additional duty relating to high-risk buildings where you need to consider whether that person, whether there's a serious sanction, prosecution, notice or other matter within the last 5 years, and then consider that. But as any of you who work in compliance and within health and safety know, that some of the very, very best people have had something go badly wrong and then thought, well, this is never going to happen again. And so some of the very best are the ones that have suffered failure in the past and learned from it. It's not so much that you failed, it's that you've learned from that experience. The competence general requirements are, when it relates to an individual, skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviors to carry out building work in accordance with the relevant requirements of the building regulations, and design work so that if it was built, it would be in accordance with the building regulations, and then to fulfill any duties you have as a contractor, designer, and on the next page, a principal designer, principal contractor. Skills, knowledge, experience is significant. It's sort of breaking that down when you think about it. I often quote myself as I'm a chartered builder, and I to become a chartered builder, I learned about the building regulations, but that was, I must write this down, about 35, 40 years ago, a long time ago. I did that study, and then I moved into CDM, and I'm now back in, and I know quite a lot about the building regulations, but only through my recent history. But for me to demonstrate competence, I can't just say I'm a chartered builder, because that doesn't prove that I have skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviors relating to the building regulations. It just says at a point in time I reached a certain level of academic provision. So we're looking at something slightly different here, and it's really important, and it'll vary across an organization depending how the organization is set up to deliver. Behaviors is new, and is significant and is important. Behaviors is that you comply with the relevant requirements. It is by default you do the right thing, and that includes refusing to carry out work which is not compliant, be it building work, be it design work if built, that would not be compliant. It's a duty to cooperate with other people, and then refusing to really significantly refusing to carry out work beyond your skills, knowledge, and experience. I still see organizations thinking, here's an opportunity, perhaps I could do the building regulations, without considering, do I have the necessary skills, knowledge, experience? You say, well, there's an opportunity, I'll do it. And actually, that's perhaps why we got where we got to with Grenfell, and why we need to change. We need to say, well, I'm honestly good enough to do this, or I'm not good enough to do this. But that's what behaviors is all about. And now I suppose the nub of what we're talking about. Any person carrying out work where they're not an individual, they're an organization, needs the organizational capability to carry out the building work, to carry out the design work, and to fulfill their duties. Organizational capability is defined within the building regulations. It applies equally to the management of occupied high-risk buildings. There is a similar requirement relating to high-risk buildings, but it's not defined there. And there are some issues with the definition in that they don't consider, I think it's fair to say, capacity. So the definition here is, and I think the top line is often forgotten, it's the management policies, procedures, systems, and resources to ensure individuals under the control of the organization comply with the competence general requirements. In other words, everybody's competent. In the case of principal designer, the competence requirements of a principal designer, similarly with the principal contractor, or are appropriately supervised. Organizational capability is in effect managing competence. The principal designer's duties needs the organizational capability to fulfill their duties as a principal designer. The principal contractor needs the organizational capability to fulfill their duties as a principal contractor. Principal contractor. Within this, where an organization is undertaking the role of principal designer or principal contractor, they need they need to appoint a designated individual, or they need to designate an individual. Now, right at the beginning, when this was being discussed as part of PAS 8671, the competence standards for individual principal designers, and actually for designated individuals, there was discussions about where this role sat, and I think it was originally envisaged that it was the lead designer, the person that was leading the design. And a number of us pointed out that you could have a competent person within a dysfunctional organization and not actually achieve anything. So it was very important that if you were going to designate an individual, they were at a sufficiently senior position to be able to, as it says here, to manage the functions. They are there to make sure that there is the required organizational capability. Competence is being managed. There are competent people to discharge the various duties, and there are the arrangements that are needed to discharge the duty. So a designated individual is probably somebody senior or reporting to somebody senior with the authority to ensure the organization can deliver what they need to do, and they manage it, the plan, do, check, act, ensure that the organization is delivering. They're not just the person at the front or the person leading that particular design. And then in relationship to principal designer, so principal designer and principal contractor under the building regulations, the new duty holder, where there is or maybe more than one contractor on a project, then the client must appoint in writing a principal designer or principal contractor. And the client needs to appoint them in writing and take all reasonable steps to satisfy them that they meet the competence general requirements and the competence requirements of the PD, which includes, if they're an organization, ensuring they have the necessary organizational capability. And as with CDM, no person should accept that appointment unless they have the competence, and unless they can actually discharge the duties of PD and PC. The building safety regulator have come out, and there's not much that they induce. There's lots of discussions about they should be issuing more guidance and where should they be issuing guidance. There's a lot of guidance out there, but they haven't endorsed many, or I think, as they say, haven't signposted many documents that aren't their own. But these documents were created. Certainly, the two on the right, the left is an update by the Department of Levelling Up, as it says there, and they are signposted by the regulator as the expected standards. So we have the BS 8670, which is the competence frameworks of building safety. That's the overarching framework. If you're creating a framework for measuring the competence of individuals, then that's the standard which you base your standard on. These are all individual standards, which is hence the need for something to cover organizational capability, which looks at organizations. As 8671 and 8672 look at or set out the expected competencies for a principal designer in the case of 8671, principal contractor in the case of 8672, and also in both cases the designated individual. But although they're set out to identify the competencies for individuals, they can be used to determine the competencies that are required by an organization to deliver the roles. And to some degree, if you are an organization that doesn't do principal designer, principal contractor, and there is no other relevant framework, you can use 8670 as your base standard to identify the competencies that you need or you should have to deliver the various things that you're going to deliver. So this came from Building Safety Alliance, is an organization that was set up to create a collaborative forum within the occupied sector. That we have the CLC, we have the CIC in construction, but there was nothing that brought the occupied sector together. So I and a couple of other people set up the Building Safety Alliance. That has undertaken a number of pieces of work, and this is, I would argue, is the most significant. We are a collaborative body. We recognise that, as I hope I've demonstrated in the legislation, that organisations need to demonstrate to their clients that they have organisational capability, and clients need some way of measuring that organisations have organisational capability. And whilst we have a definition relating to building work, we don't have a methodology, and that's what the standard tries to do. Those involved in the working group that put this together, I was the technical author, but the working group is a as you see, quite wide-ranging. We have been observed by the building safety regulator throughout. We've had UCAS involvement, we have British Standards involvement, and all of these various bodies have been involved in the development. I suppose our greatest achievement was being asked to present in May at the Building Safety Conference on the standard, which, as much as an endorsement as you're ever going to get from the regulator as the third party, I think is an indication that we're on the right track. It isn't the answer, but it is an answer, and it's asking the right questions and prompting the right thought processes. The standard's available. I would say, if you want a copy of the standard, can you get your request in fairly soon? I'm just away on disappearing on holiday at the end of the week, and I'm the one that has to send them all out. I shall try to brief my colleagues for those that arrive while I'm away. The standard's there to support the other competence frameworks that we've touched on. That they are the documents that provide the required competencies, and the standard looks at how you manage to ensure all those that are involved in your undertaking have those necessary competencies. The Common Assessment Standard is out there. It has some questions relating to organisational capability, but it's in their words, we obviously talked to them and liaised with them. It's a pre-qualification questionnaire. It doesn't tell you how to manage competence. It just asks you simple questions as are you, and can you demonstrate it. This is setting out how you might go about managing competence, and then ultimately our next piece of work, which started last week, is to create a scheme to measure against these requirements, so that our ultimate aim is that, particularly in the occupied sector, clients can say to a managing agent, are you competent? Clients can say to a principal designer, are you competent? Do you have organisational capability? And you say, yes, I meet these standards. As I said, there's a slight problem with the definition in the building regulations, and I think that's been recognised. I understand. I am not on the ICC, but I understand that the ICC are looking at definitions, and in the revised definition, they've taken cognizance of what it says here, and it's that top line that's different. Is accepting that you can have an organisation where everybody is competent, but you might not have enough competent people. And then the piece at the bottom, which is the culture. So this starts on with the collective skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours required to deliver identified objectives. And the new piece in the latest revision is the contractual obligations that came back through feedback. This needs to be output driven. This needs to be, if you're not creating competence for its sake, but you're creating competence to deliver safe buildings. And then we come into the definition within the building regulations, which is individuals under the control of the organisation have the skills, knowledge, experience necessary to deliver their role in accordance with statutory provisions. The reality of this standard is that it tries to be agnostic. It doesn't. Whilst it will its intention is relating to the Building Safety Act and the legislation that falls out of it, but it can be applied to any competence requirements. Is completely agnostic. And then training and appropriately supervised. As with any management standard, there's an expectation that where you engage third-party organisations, they themselves have organisational capability. And the final piece, which is really important, is the appropriate standard of organisational culture. And the culture comes in sort of three elements. The first piece is that there is top management commitment. There has to be commitment for this, any management system standard, but this to be able to deliver it. The second piece is the organisation has to believe this is what the intention is for it to happen. And the final bit is that there is a culture within the organisation that allows the people to behave in accordance with their statutory duties. And all those three things are really essential if you're going to deliver the standard. When we created the standard, we were challenged by the RABA said, look, we have organisations that are accredited members, certified members, and they need to have a quality management system. What we don't want to do is create another management system they need to have. So you need to create something that will dovetail into the quality management system, and that's why it's created in a management system standard, and then it follows the numbering system of BS0, the management system standard. We also had the Property Institute who said, you mustn't forget the small organizations. If we have many members that are 5 people or less, you have to make this accessible, because those are the people that most need to manage competence, to understand, to upskill. So we've created what's called the core principles, and it's likely that in the initial stages, that any scheme that we create will be based upon the core principles rather than the full standard. So how does it work? If you start with the requirements on the left, any organization, the latest definition, an organization, you can apply this to the entire organization, a division within the organization, and we've accepted that organization needs to also mean a project. You can apply this to a project. It's a temporary organization in effect. So you start by identifying, I suppose, what it is you need it to apply to. The next piece is to identify what legislation and standards apply. So in this case, you've got, as somebody pointed out, we've missed out the Building Safety Act. So you've got the Building Safety Act. You've got the HRB Management of Building Safety Risk, which includes the competence requirements of in relation to occupation, the building regulations 2010 Part 2A, the competence requirements in relationship to building regulations compliance. And then you have the standards, which is 861, 2 and 3. You take that objective and the standards, and you start to create your system. The first piece is, as we've alluded to, relating to the cultural piece, is 5.1, is top management, leadership and commitment. You have to have that to make this work. The next piece on there in the core principle is 5.3, assign organization roles, responsibilities and authorities. And I have to say that came on later, but a realization trying to implement that we are working with a number of organizations implementing this. It's that real realization that it looks different in every organization. How you structure an organization to deliver whatever role it is you want to do is going to be different for every organization. And therefore, the competencies required by different members of the team will vary and will be based upon that understanding of the organization. And there's another piece to that is it will vary depending on the processes you have. So you need to understand that how your organization is going to deliver it before you can work out how what the competencies are. The next piece is the planning. You're going to use those roles, your understanding of your processes, and the competency standards to create a competence register, and we'll look at that in a second. And from that register, you create role competence statements for every role. You then measure people undertaking that role against that competency standard, and then either validates that they have the required competencies, or identifies where you need to provide additional skills, knowledge, or supervise them while they gain the additional experience. Clearly, part 7, this needs resources. It's easiest in a small organization, and a large organization requires a change of thinking, that you recruit against competence rather than recruiting against the CV. It needs to be written down. As every management system, longevity requires you to document both the system and the records that come out of the system. Relating to operation, you, as I've alluded to, you need to modify the recruitment process so that for every role you recruit against, you set out the competency requirements for those roles and make sure that you measure those applying against those competency requirements. Performance management, where you've got existing people, you're applying the system to an existing organization, you clearly need to measure people already within the organization, and then you need to monitor them to make sure that they are moving in the right direction, or keeping up to speed with developments in the industry. And where they don't achieve that, you've got training and development, which allows you to provide skills, provide knowledge, and to supervise them. You've also got career development and succession planning. As people move through the organization, the competencies change. Very important, contractor and consultant engagement and management, making sure that those who you engage have the right competence. And then finally, within the core principles, you have organizational culture. You need to, as I've said, make sure people can behave in accordance with their statutory duties. It is really important that this is output driven. It is really important that this delivers safe buildings. And so you need some sort of way of measuring compliance, measuring failure. So near misses relating to design, near misses relating to construction. It's in a way where you have mandatory occurrence reporting. It's applying that to all sorts of work to which the building regulations apply. If we hadn't caught this, it could have caused a problem. Was the driver for that failure a lack of competence? If it is, what do we need to do about that, so that we're reviewing this to make sure it's delivering what we need to do? And the final piece is that improvement. And my realization now, I said we're starting off with the scheme, and we're thinking going for the core principles rather than the full standard, because I don't think any organization, or very few organizations, would be ready to go in with a full requirement and full requirement. When we go through the competencies, you understand you need to stay high if you're going to achieve an outcome, and then over a period of time improve. The ICC are talking about competence in the industry being a 10-year project. That in some ways is problematic, because we need competence now. But the reality is, to get this where the industry is competent and are managing competence, is going to take some time. This is by no means an answer. This is by way of illustration that there are a number of different ways of delivering anything. So looking at the role of principal designer, I came up with a couple of diagrams that just illustrate the variety. So on the one on the right, you have they don't have enough competence within house. They don't do enough work to have a designated individual in the house. So you have an external person advising the CEO. But then the organization, the skills they need to deliver the role out with that are already within the team. On the one on the left, you've got a director who understands this and could be a designated individual, but it may be that you don't have sufficient building regulations specialism or CDM specialist, and that comes from the outside. Then there are many ways you can weave this. You then look at the competency matrix. So if you look at the top right, you've got the roles across the top, and you've the first piece is, how many people do we need? How many people have we got? That's your first question. Do we need more people to deliver what we need to do? I've applied here using 8671 the first competency standard, and what you'll see is 4.3.1 is the minimum competency standard, and then I've got the specific competencies below it. I'm of the belief that's probably try to respond to each of those competencies and evidence each competence is probably too much at the minute for most people. So I think you stick with the minimum competencies and have due regard to the sub-competencies in response, and you'll see in a minute how that works through. In this diagram, I've taken just the minimum competencies. So 4.2, 3, 4, 5, A, B, and C. Those are the core competencies. When you complete it, you would need sight of the specific competencies. But so when you're responding to it, it's easier it's less bureaucratic to have to try to deal with each piece. It became clear, and looking at other competent management systems and standards across the world, that generally speaking, there are levels of competence. This one's taken from an environmental standard, and I've mapped it against the National Qualifications Framework, which is another piece of work that we did. This is a work in progress. All of this is indicative of a process rather than the answer. So if you're looking at an organization, you'll have trainees at basic level. You might have directors would be at a capable level, and your designated individual may be authoritative. But there may be cases where you've got authoritative knowledge. I met with an organization the other day where they had a number of registered building control inspectors at a very senior level. And arguably, the director, who was the designated individual, didn't need to be authoritative on the building regulations because they had plenty of that. He needed to understand the processes that need to be in place and to have a dialogue with the specialists, but he didn't necessarily need that authoritative. No, he probably needed to be accomplished. So you would look at that. And this is how it maps out. So those are the competency frameworks, those competency requirements, those are the levels. Please don't take this as a given. These are by way of illustration. I mean, there's a little bit of science to the numbers that I put in there, but it's just me trying to indicate what it might look like rather than being the answer. You then take that and try and put that into a role competence statement. So for this role competence statement for a designated individual, those are the competency requirements. Does it apply, yes or no? What level is it required? You'll notice it's slightly different here. And then you move on to the evidence phase. So you're taking that and you're either giving it to the individual and say, can you please provide a response? Or talking to the design practice I said, I think the best way you will achieve this is to sit down and have a conversation with somebody. So if you're leading this assessment process, you sit down and say, well, this is what we're trying to achieve. This is what you need to be, and can we have a conversation about what that looks like and how you might provide the narrative and the evidence. And the narrative and the evidence, I think, is important. It came out of the back of the APS Association of Project Safety Principal Designer Scheme, Individual Principal Designer Scheme, where they recognise that evidence alone is difficult to read and understand and difficult to provide, but a narrative on its own doesn't provide the evidence. But the combination of the two, you can read it and go, yeah, I can see where, why they would think they're competent, and here's some evidence to support that narrative. You then move on to the next stage, which is reviewing against it. So you've got that narrative, and you've got the evidence, and the person overseeing the scheme. One of the things that's come out of recent thoughts about this is that it is really important that the person who is in charge of the scheme, the competence manager, for want of a better word, is competent themselves. That's really, really important. That they absolutely need to understand what they're doing in setting the levels. They'll need to work with others. We've spoken to a number of large organizations that are already doing this, and they require the managers of the department to set the competencies, but there needs to be somebody who understands enough to be able to lead them and guide them into that process. And the other thing is that there are some roles it's the safety critical roles. So there are some roles where you need to put more emphasis. And a lot of that thinking came out of iStruct. Structural engineers are really focused on that. There are certain checking roles, a certain type of works that is really, really important, and the effort put into ensuring that individual is competent to do what they do and remains competent is really important. So you need to also look at which roles are safety critical, and perhaps as I speak to you now, it's something that I probably ought to capture in this example role competence statement. So that person reviewing that will look at the evidence and the narrative and say, well, based upon the information on that first item, I'm happy they've been doing this, they've got the skills and they've got the experience, they've been doing it for long enough. But in practice, I don't think they can provide the evidence that they've actually got the core knowledge. They probably have, but there's no evidence of the knowledge. So it's marked down. Is then you take that away and try to resolve that issue, and that'll involve supervision by somebody competent while they gain the knowledge. It'll include training in the case of knowledge. I think we look a bit further down, you've got on 4.5b, lack of experience. Well, clearly that requires some supervision while that experience is some mentoring while that's happening. Behaviors is fairly linear. You either got it or not. So similarly, it's a narrative and it's evidence. There's no level of competency, no levels relating to behaviors. You either have the necessary behaviors or you don't have the necessary behaviors. That's it. I'm probably 5 minutes early, which is remarkable for me, but any questions? I'm waiting for but I've got a couple of questions in front of me that I will try to answer. The advice of how you get a copy. I included the link within the presentation, and I think you better look again. But it's Building Safety Alliance .org.uk. There is a page there where you can sign up. The standard was created from a standard borrowed from the British Standard Institute, and because it was borrowed, we had to get a license to be able to provide it. And because it will become will become part of the seed information when the British standards create their standard in, I think, the later part of this year is most likely is when they start working on it. We have to get anybody's agreement to download it to take part. So we take your details, we'll then send it out to you, and we'll contact you in due course to say, what did you think about it? Where are the errors? What experience do you have in implementing it? What could we change when it's moved to a British standard? The other question relates to who is and who isn't the principal contractor. I probably could talk for England on the subject. The truth is, principal designer role is managing the design and managing the design for compliance. And the long and the short of it is, if you are an individual or organization that manages design, that's what you do, or you have done so in the past, you can be the principal designer. If you haven't, you probably shouldn't be. It is unlikely you're going to be competent. You can set up an organization to do it, but you need to understand what managing design is, and the standard. I want to say the stuff off the top of my head, but there is a British management standard for design management. I know it's part 3, which is design management in the construction industry. Sets out that process, but it is all about design management. It isn't somebody sitting at the side of the design saying, with a checklist saying, give me signed declarations that I think your work's compliant, or even just reviewing it and saying, well, I'm running through a checklist and rolling a design tracker, although having a design tracker is part of that role. I don't think I've got any more questions. I shall sit here and wait for the administrator. I've come back on. I've got one more question. The likes of ARB have produced their own competency frameworks in response to BSAS documents. It's somewhat frustrating. This is wording differently to the point that it makes it difficult for individuals to self-appraise. I think it's. I don't know the standard in question. Every standard should be. For it to be valid, it needs to be established in accordance with PAS 8670. I mean, that's the expected requirements. But there is, as I said, this connection between individual competence and organizational capability. So if you looked at those 2 different diagrams I gave you, you've got a situation where in that organization I met, they have some really specialist people who are registered building control inspectors, therefore have gone through a competency framework. So it's pretty much a given relating to anything that they're registered against, the level they're registered against. They are going to be competent in relating to the building regulations. So therefore, that affects the competence of other people. So other members of the organization perhaps don't need as much competence as if they weren't there. So the designated individual, I said, needs a different level of competence. We then looked at the detail of how somebody was going to discharge the role, and it was quite clear that one of the things that a lead designer needed to do was to identify when there was a design change. And then it occurred to us that design changes might happen away from the lead designer. It might be part of a contractor's piece, and would it get back to the lead designer? So you then start to think, is who needs to know what? I mean, it really needs to be down to that level as organizational capability. What do they need to know within this framework to deliver what we need to do? So it's that combination of understanding your procedures for delivering this, and they will vary across the organization and the team you have and how they work, and then looking at the required competencies. Is it too sophisticated? Perhaps. In the long term, you will have loads of organizations. I heard, I think I can say, iStruct are working towards a framework based on 8670. So at some point in the future, it's an area probably where being a chartered engineer probably counts for something, because it's like that's assuming that they are practicing, and that's a piece. But once that competency framework exists, then you can take it as a given as part of your competency framework that they meet a certain level of competence, and then ultimately in the future managing competence will be much easier, because every professional body will have a register that will demonstrate competence and then moving down to sort of technical levels, every trade body will have and that's where the future lies with all of this, I think. But it's a long way to get there. And if you do one change, it's switching to this: what competencies do people need within our team? Do they have them? What do I need to do in the meantime to make sure that we resolve that issue?
Okay. I think that's all our questions. Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone who has joined us this morning. Just to remind you that this session has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel soon, which can be shared with your colleagues. With that, I'll wrap up, and thank you again. And hopefully I'll see you next week for our next webinar. Thank you all.